Hello, I'm Sara Garcia, researcher from Inside Crime. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you all. We're very happy to have you join us today for this series of presentations by Inside Crime on cross-border crime in Central America's Northern Triangle and the Tri-Border region in the Southern Cone. During today's event, we will be doing a deep dive into organized crime in El Salvador and along its borders, wrapping up a 6-part series in which our team has presented the findings of an extensive investigation into transnational organized crime in these two border regions. This work was financed by PMI Impact, a funding initiative by Philip Morris International. This event is being broadcast live on the Inside Crime Facebook page in English. We invite you to participate by sending your questions in the YouTube chat and through our social media networks on Twitter and Facebook. All those following the event can continue to participate by using the hashtag #BorderCrime. The event will be divided into 3 parts. We will start with a presentation on the main transnational organized crime trends in El Salvador and along its borders. We will then review the departments that are most affected by these dynamics by using our interactive map. And finally, we will present an analysis of the relationship between cross-border crime and corruption. Joining us today are our co-director, Stephen Dudley, who will be serving as our moderator, and the participation of investigator and project coordinator Ángela Olaya and investigators Alicia Flórez and Victoria Dittmar. I will now turn things over to Stephen Dudley. Thank you, Sara. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on wherever you are. I'm Stephen Dudley. I'm the co-founder and co-director of Inside Crime, along with Jeremy McDermott. Thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to tell you all a little about this project and the interactive site that accompanies it. The idea behind this effort was to take a close look at 2 tri-border regions, the Northern Triangle, made up of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and the tri-border region of Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. For this project, we profiled all of the departments or border states, 39 in total, in these 2 regions. We analyzed the criminal economies that were present and the criminal actors that manage them. It required extensive field research, which unfortunately was interrupted by the COVID pandemic. A significant part of the results of this work are reflected on our website, where we have gathered all of the elements of the investigation: department profiles, homicide data, profiles of the main criminal actors, and overviews of the nature and scope of the criminal economies. A great deal of this information is represented on the interactive map. To show you how it works, we have a video for you. We invite you to visit the website and to conduct your own investigations. The objective of today's event is to present a synthesis of the results of our field research in El Salvador. After each presentation, we will provide a space for you to dig deeper with your questions. Unfortunately, there is no quick and simple solution to these criminal challenges. But we firmly believe that the answers must be strategic, long-term, and based on lasting regional and international cooperation. Thank you for your attention. And now we'll hand things over to Ángela, who will provide us with an overview of El Salvador's criminal panorama. Ángela? Thank you very much, Steve. Well, yes, in this first section, I'll be responsible for presenting some of the most important national trends in regards to transnational organized crime in El Salvador. I would like to point out that in analyzing El Salvador within its regional context, we see that the country shares some similarities with its neighbors, but there is one particular characteristic that fundamentally sets it apart. So I would like to start telling you a little bit about these two similarities that we have identified, and then I will close by highlighting the main difference that we see. So the first similarity would be about drug trafficking and money laundering. There are indicators that El Salvador was and continues to be an important point for cocaine transit and money laundering. As shown by drug seizures from 2020, based on reports by the Salvadoran government, drug seizures increased considerably, with 2.7 tons confiscated by November of 2020, whereas the year previous, 2019, only 1.3 tons were seized. 1.3 tons less were seized. They also point out that one of the most important operations that occurred at that time happened in Alamatillo in the Union, which is the entry point for all products that come in through the Pacific Ocean, and which tells us that the reactivation of land routes of drug trafficking are starting. So specifically, we see the drug trafficking routes seem to be more active than ever in the southern part of the country. This is despite the fact that we do not have dominant groups like we had before. The organizations that transport drugs, the so-called transporters, have been breaking up, and today it's difficult to know who they are because they are much smaller groups. This situation coincides with what is occurring in the neighboring countries of Honduras and Guatemala, where clan-led groups dominated entire regions. They controlled large illicit businesses and maintained absolute control over their centers of activity. However, nowadays, after the arrests of their leaders, these clans fragmented and mixed with other actors. That is to say, nowadays in El Salvador, we do not see the existence of monolithic groups throughout the country, like the Texas cartel or Los Perrones used to be. The two groups that dominated drug trafficking at different times over the last 20 years in El Salvador. What we see now is a combination of factions or former members of these cartels that are competing in some areas with those aspiring to enter the drug trafficking market. However, what we see in El Salvador is that it was and continues to be a hub for money laundering. It's a very important hub for drug trafficking because it's a dollarized economy. But even so, in this case, although we have money laundering centers, we can't identify specific money laundering centers like there used to be. The last large visible case was that of José Adán Salazar Umaña, alias Chepe Diablo. And while we assume that there are networks, we don't really have any clear indication of powerful groups extending into several departments, as did previously Los Perrones and the Texas cartel. A second similarity is that the country, like others in the region, has corruption cases from top to bottom. But the most important thing is that there is a mixture of actors, a combination of actors involved that make us believe that there is a reconfiguration within the country's elites and their relationship with organized crime. This element fits country and regional patterns, as we see that in the region there is a confluence of actors that interact with intermediaries that serve as a go-between for politicians and criminals. An example of this are the corruption cases that we saw that were reported around the COVID pandemic. This is very concerning because acts of corruption are channeled through networks they are building and which normally revolve around political ties as if they were mafia groups. Along these same lines, we see what happens with the investigation of the General Prosecution Office of the Republic of what happened with the pandemic emergency funds, including a contract for over $200,000 for the purchase of rubber boots from an automotive spare parts company owned by an aunt of the current Minister of Health, Francisco Lavie. But this has also happened before, such as the case of Alba Petróleos, where the United States Congress has asked José Luis Merino to be punished as the historic leader of the FMLN and the Alba Petróleos Consortium for what they call long-standing ventures with organized crime networks that are the subject of criminal investigations in the United States. Then there was the case of Helbert Saca, a political operator of several administrations in El Salvador who has been investigated for possible links to different drug trafficking groups such as Los Perrones. Despite these accusations, however, Helbert continues to be a political operator for El Salvador. This shows a confluence of interests, as is the case in neighboring countries of Honduras and Guatemala. There is a growing intersection between political and criminal actors. Now, this is not just on a national level. On a local level, it also happens, as in the case of the former mayor of Apopa, José Elias Hernández, who was sentenced in February of this year to 5 years in prison for attempted murder. Or more recently, with the FGR investigations against Roel Werner Martínez Romero, mayor of the municipality of El Tránsito in San Miguel. These two people have been arrested for their ties to the gangs. With this, I'm going to move on to our third point, which is the differentiating aspect. Gangs and their ability to establish a presence on a country level, as well as their maturation as a group. This is what differentiates El Salvador from its neighbors, the presence and power of the gangs, as well as the increasingly decisive role they play in the underworld and in Salvadoran politics. As opposed to what we see in Honduras or Guatemala, the presence of gangs, specifically Mara Salvatrucha or Barrio 18 in El Salvador, have a very strong national presence. If we put this on a regional context, in which El Salvador is the smallest country of the Northern Triangle, it has had the longest history with the presence of these gangs, and we can see how these gangs have spread to every corner of the country. This national presence has positioned the country to have more and more of an established role in transnational crime. In this sense, we should differentiate, and this is very important, MS-13 from Barrio 18. MS-13 is the gang that appears to be most closely linked to the cross-border criminal activities. Just to cite an example, because we could talk about the formal accusation in the United States, it talks about how the MS-13 leaders brought more than 100 kilos of marijuana belonging to their Mexican allies into the U.S. in exchange for large amounts of money. We reiterate, that is not common. The third element that differentiates the Salvadoran gang from its neighbors is its political interference. As we have documented in several reports from Insight Crime, the way the gangs have established alliances with several municipalities, given their strong control and ability to exercise violence and extortion, in key municipalities such as San Salvador has led them to play an important role and to generate constant strategic exchanges in terms of political, social, and economic capital. The most troubling and recent evidence of this is a possible exchange with the current government. It appears that in exchange for a reduction in homicides in the country, spaces were opened for them in prisons and outside of prisons, especially in their areas of concentration, where it seems that they were allowed to become intermediaries between the government and the programs providing social aid to their communities, which would give the gangs political and social capital. It's very important to highlight that this has not been reported only by Insight Crime, but also by El Faro and by the International Crisis Group, although each has their own distinct focus. But what we can see is that precisely by 2020, El Salvador reported a homicide rate of 19.7 homicides per 100,000 residents, which represented a near 45% decline in homicides, and therefore one of the most significant declines in homicides in the country's recent history. In consideration, the government officials succeeded not only in implementing their development projects, but also in opening up spaces for political campaigns in areas controlled by the gangs. It's not that we're against the decline in homicides or violence. On the contrary, a decline in violence is always welcome when it is the result of a transparent negotiation between the parts, and not something that could be categorized as a secret political pact. With these three elements, two similarities and one differenting factor, then I'll turn things over to Steve. Ángela, thank you very much. You left a bomb at the end. This is very strong and obviously needs to be explored a bit. But taking a step back, I'd like you to start by characterizing the current transport groups. In other countries, we've profiled those groups, and we've given certain descriptions saying that these are clans, or these are former smugglers, or these are mixed up with politicians. How can we categorize these new groups of transporters? Like you said, before what we would find were clans that were quite structured and which were the ones that controlled the entire transport dynamics. Often they controlled the routes, smuggling routes, for instance. However, right now what we're seeing is organizations that don't have these characteristics. We're not talking about specific clans. We have to be talking about small groups. In fact, some of our sources in the field work talked about these groups as baby cartels. They're very small groups where everyone is trying to get into drug trafficking, which is into the transport part. And in some cases, they have a strong presence in one department that's important on the route. In other cases, what we see, for example, is former members of these cartels that were able to keep contacts and elements that allow them to participate, but they're not organized monolithic groups like they used to be. So it's a much more rudimentary exercise from what we were seeing 10 years ago. Within that drug trafficking scenario, are there any changes when it comes to where the drugs are going? There's a question from the audience here. Or is it the same routes, just that the actors have changed? Indeed, yes. It's the same routes that have been reactivated according to the pressure from authorities on one side or another, but it's the same routes that we've been seeing for many years, just that the actors are changing right now. That's why we're talking about the fragmentation of these groups and the reactivation, and not new routes, but rather reactivation of routes that are going north. I'd like to welcome Victoria to this discussion as well and ask Victoria directly about that reconfiguration of the groups, because I know that you also did some research in Honduras. And what we were talking about in the Honduras event was how transport groups are mixing with political groups. I wonder, is the same thing happening in El Salvador? Or what sort of reconfiguration of elites are we seeing in El Salvador? Yes, this dynamic that you mentioned, it's a pattern that's repeated not only in El Salvador and Honduras, but also in Guatemala. It's a regional trend. What we've seen, like Ángela mentioned, in the past there were huge groups that controlled entire departments, entire regions, and they had very high-level contacts with the government or with security officials. What we're seeing today is that fragmentation that Ángela mentioned, which makes it very difficult to identify these new actors. In Honduras, for instance, I think that the clearest example in Guatemala is that on a very local level, on a municipal level, we saw the participation of mayors or regions within these structures participating hand in hand with criminal actors. Gangs, maybe. We have mixed structures. It's not just, like in the case of El Salvador, it's not just Los Perrones or the Texas cartel anymore. No, we're seeing mixed groups now. Successors of these same groups that are mixing together with local politicians. In El Salvador, we've started seeing lots of mayors. Ángela mentioned this as well. Insight Crime has focused on this, but there's a difficulty for us now because of the mixed and complex nature of these groups, there are many nuances to understand them, and it's hard to understand how deep they go. But in the case of the gangs, we know that they have political capital, and in many areas, for instance, San Salvador, in the center of San Salvador, it's necessary to have certain collaboration or informal pacts. It's not the same. It's not the same as direct participation as we see in Honduras, which is where we're seeing the highest levels of politics involved in organized crime. But coming back to the question, what we see is that on these micro levels, on local levels, we see a greater participation of political actors in these new mixed actors that are filling the power gaps that the large groups left. Some years ago, there was a case that Ángela mentioned, which was the case of Chepe Diablo. In the conversations and the multiple interviews that you conducted in the country, were you able to find out whether there was an effect from those cases, those types of cases? Was the money laundering kingpin brought down? Did that have any impact? Did it have any impact? When it comes to money laundering? No, because the same thing that we've seen, the same as with the drug trafficking, when we get rid of these big kingpins or drug lords or, the leader, the successor of such and such a group, there are power gaps and new groups come in and seize that power. In El Salvador, money laundering is still very active in areas like San Miguel, La Unión, even in San Salvador. So obviously, yes, they speared a big fish, but the activities continue. And the dollarized economy, like Angela mentioned, makes El Salvador very attractive for money laundering. We have more questions, and I would like Alicia to speak, but let's continue to the second part, where Alicia is going to share information with us, and we'll continue with the good questions that we're getting later on. So, I'm going to hand things over to Alicia, who's going to tell us about investigations on the border regions. Thank you, Steve. In the first part, Ángela explained the national trends. Now I'm going to talk about some departments in El Salvador where these points are exemplified. So in the first part, we explained that El Salvador is a transit country for drugs going north, and that it is a hub for money laundering. In our investigations on the border departments, we saw that San Miguel has the same characteristics. The departments in eastern El Salvador are the most affected by drug trafficking. San Miguel is located on the cocaine transit route that enters through the Gulf of Fonseca from Nicaragua and continues to Guatemala via the Pan American Highway. One thing that caught our attention is that despite its location at the heart of the route that we were describing, cocaine seizures are scarce. Between January and September of 2019, authorities seized 125 grams of cocaine over 85 operations. It's no coincidence that the eastern part of the country was the center of operations for Los Perrones, the group of transporters that Ángela mentioned earlier, that specialized in moving cocaine in El Salvador. The power of this cartel was concentrated in San Miguel. The department became an important money laundering hub. The leaders of Los Perrones used hotels, restaurants, hardware stores, car lots in order to launder the money from their activities. And those businesses still exist. After the fall of its leaders, family members and members of the Perrones remained, and today the city of San Miguel remains the center of operations for the remaining remnants of this group that were left in the region. During our visit to the city, we saw how this kind of business could be linked to money laundering. And with San Miguel being located at the heart of the transit route, we can assume that money is circulating. After several of these hotels and restaurants were closed, we can see that the economy is reactivating and these businesses are thriving again. As some experts explained to us, the resurgence of businesses in San Miguel has been in progress for several years. So, quoting one of the people that we spoke with, there's a lot of money in San Miguel. They built commercial centers, buildings, and more. Additionally, as Victoria will explain later on, we saw that the cocaine inlet into El Salvador through the Pacific and Nicaragua has not stopped since the cartel was dismantled. The second thing I want to talk about, I'll take advantage of the fact that I'm talking about the cocaine routes, and let's move on to the second aspect, to the west of El Salvador. The city of Metapan, located in Santa Ana, almost on the border with Guatemala, has been strategic for cocaine trafficking in El Salvador. That's why another group of transporters also operated there, the Texas Cartel, which was famous for its ties to political elites in border towns. Over the years, we've documented how drug trafficking organizations have built ties with politicians and security forces to ensure their operations, a pattern seen throughout the region. The former mayor of Metapan, Juan Umaña Samayoa, for example, has been accused of money laundering as a member of the Texas Cartel. The links between the mayor's office in Metapan and organized crime have expanded to some members of the National Civil Police, and even extended to other municipalities such as Texixtepeque, the municipality inspiring the name of the group, the Texas Cartel. Now, The inheritors of this cartel may have maintained contact with the authorities to establish themselves in the area, but we can't tell how active they are. On our last visit to the department of Santa Ana in the city of Metapan, we could clearly see that the area continues to be a key point for drug transit. While the authorities do not report any major incidents by pointing out that Metapan is only used as a transit spot to reach larger cities, they also recognize the impossibility of controlling blind spots. One local authority member said to us, "The lack of patrols and authorities on the border, if we had more staff, everything would be different." Which places Metapan in the same situation as when the Texas cartel exerted influence over this territory. Now, to enter the third topic. I would like to use Ahuachapán as an example. This department reflects perfectly the points that Ángela explained at the beginning of the presentation regarding the evolution of gangs in El Salvador. The MS-13 in Ahuachapán has consolidated its territorial presence, its ability to negotiate with political institutions, and has managed to develop links with transnational organized crime. The gang has a strong presence in the department. In our investigation, we found that the gang is present in 9 out of 12 municipalities. The main activity of the MS-13 is extortion, but they're also involved in micro-trafficking and also provide security for drug shipments that travel throughout the department towards the border with Guatemala. They are subcontracted by larger groups in some cases, and sometimes these groups are Guatemalan. The MS-13 also receives marijuana shipments coming from Guatemala that are later distributed throughout El Salvador, specifically for local drug sales. And the gang is also involved in weapons dealing, but in a smaller scale. There are more buyers than sellers. They buy the weapons from Guatemalan groups, taking advantage of the nearness to the border. In Ahuachapán, there's also a presence of the Sureños faction of Barrio 18, one of the 2 factions of the gang in El Salvador. However, the scope of this gang cannot be compared to the other. For this reason, it's rare to hear about gang clashes in Ahuachapán. This tells us that the MS-13 has a greater presence than its rivals. In fact, what most caught our attention in the city of Ahuachapán is the level of criminal governance exercised by the gang. In our methodology, criminal governance can be expressed in different ways, from providing security by the gang to public services, to implementing laws or social punishments, controlling prisons, etc. A clear example that we saw in the city was when certain public officials needed to ask the MS-13 for authorization through intermediaries to enter certain neighborhoods on medical missions. And now I'll turn things over to Steve and open the space for questions. Thank you. Thank you, Alicia. I'd like to start where you ended to understand that process, that maturation process of the gang, specifically the MS-13. According to what you're saying, this same group is making a big step, taking a big step towards transnational activities. Do we see that reality only in Ahuachapán, or do we see this happening in other departments on the border as well? Well, Steve, I think that the answer to that question is that it's not just Ahuachapán. We also saw it in other territories. And now Victoria is going to talk a little bit more about that in a very specific case study in La Unión. But I think it mainly happens on these border regions that have access to more activity, not just extortion. So, for example, marijuana flow provides the opportunity to make more profits through small-scale drug trafficking or through weapons dealing, which can pay for security on the shipments. They're paid with weapons or drugs. So they're opening up space to evolve a bit more. It may be something very specific to the border regions, and maybe it's not as uniform throughout the rest of the country. I think that would be the answer. The authorities in these regions, did they tell you that these groups are bringing large amounts of marijuana and entering through this department in order to sell drugs on a small scale? Is that what I understand? Yes, exactly. That's what we were explained, some inside sources. Do you also offer protection to do they also offer protection to cocaine shipments that could be passing through the region? Yes, exactly. Ahuachapan is on the Guatemalan border, which permits the transit on the Pan American route towards the north. Cocaine can go through El Salvador. And what authorities on site were explaining were saying that in the past, I can't say that it's happening currently, but the MS-13 was subcontracted to lend security to these shipments by foreign actors. In regards to the criminal governance, or however you want to call it, in other spaces, in Honduras for instance, we've talked with people from the community who say that MS-13 would get involved in domestic violence cases, for instance. Are members of the MS-13 involved this deep in terms of their criminal governance in places like Huachapan? I think so. I think that what happens with the gang is that their presence in the territories and their influence is so strong that in some cases they're seen as the authority. They're the authorities that the population turns to. Sometimes they can feed off of the lack of presence of official authorities in the region, or also because of the links that the gangs have with the communities. Generally, members of the gangs have family members in these territories, so this facilitates the MS-13 having close connection with the population, with the community, and filling these authority gaps, although it's not always a good thing. Ángela, let's talk a little bit more on a national level. Why does the MS-13 have a larger presence than Barrio 18? Why have they managed to take control of so much space and have more members and have a stronger political influence? What do you think are some of the main reasons? Well, first of all, I think that to analyze the MS-13 and that differentiation between Barrio 18, it's important to see this group as a much more disciplined group, more than Barrio 18. We have to remember that the leaders of MS-13, the Ramplas, tried to generate programs that would give certain parameters to each one of their actors. And beyond how successful those parameters were, whether they achieved their final goals, we can see a larger discipline between the MS-13 members than between the Barrio 18 members. I think this is the biggest difference between the two gangs. That's what I would say. There are much fewer homicides. We can't talk about violence per se, but there have been fewer homicides. And we can say that there are much fewer homicides. How do we explain this reduction in the homicide rate in the country? Well, I think that in this reduction of homicide rate, we have to bring up the question of the territorial control plan of the government, where what we've identified is the possibility, the evolution of that the gangs and their leaders have had on a territorial level, and the reading that they could have made of this territorial control plan. I would think that there are three basic interpretations that we can do. One, their relationship with the communities, like Alicia mentioned earlier. Probably there's a reading of this link with the communities, which is closer than historic groups. So that reduces the confrontation with authorities. And on the other hand, we can also see the idea that the homicides, as we were saying earlier, these homicides, not these homicides, sorry, I'm getting confused, sorry. What we could think is that if we see that there's a maturation of the groups when it comes to interference in politics and obtaining political capital, probably this violence that they used to work with when it comes to extortion and homicide is not so necessary for them anymore right now. And because of that, we could be saying that, yes, in the face of the strengthening of these groups, there has been a reduction in the violence, because violence is not so necessary anymore. Yes, I think it's very difficult to reduce it to just one single element, of course. And the country is still very dynamic. I didn't want to get out of the border regions without asking about the different criminal economies. That was a question that we received from the audience. And in other spaces like Guatemala, we were talking a lot about different criminal economies on the borders, particularly human trafficking. And I don't know if, Vic, could you fill us in a little bit about this? What other criminal activities were you able to observe or obtain any information on them? What's going on the borders? Yes, of course. The most lucrative criminal activity is definitely cocaine trafficking. But aside from drug trafficking, which after cocaine, marijuana, cannabis is the second largest, we identify that human trafficking is very lucrative as well. Prices for a human trafficker can be $10,000 to bring somebody to the border with the United States. So if we think about how many people hire coyotes, those human smugglers, we did a calculation in Insight Crime, and we realized that this is a business that is generating millions of dollars. So the large-scale criminal activities in the area are these: drug trafficking and human trafficking, and also human sexual and enslavement trafficking. Although it's difficult to calculate how much money this is generating, because it's activity that's not very widely reported, like extortion. But the transnational activities on a lower scale that we identified was weapons trafficking, lumber trafficking. We were able to identify that in the Department of La Paz in the north of El Salvador, they are smuggling illegal timber that's being sold in El Salvador at a higher price. It's a much smaller operation, but it still happens. Contraband, we also identified on all the borders. For instance, in areas between Honduras and Guatemala, in Agua Caliente, Nicoy, where there are a lot of people, there's a lot of smuggling as well. So yes, definitely. We have criminal activities, smuggling from drugs, people, weapons, timber. Even in Guatemala, we even saw jade smuggling, which we haven't seen in other parts of the region. But anyway, we focused on investigating a wide range of criminal activities, which you can see on the interactive map. And there you can see exactly what municipality, what department, in what department are these criminal economies present. Excellent. There are many more questions, of course, but we must continue to the next section, which would be the case study. So I'll hand things over to Victoria. Thank you, Steve. Well, I'm going to present our case study, which you can read in its totality on our website, on the main page. It's an investigation that focuses specifically on the department of La Unión, which is on the Pacific coast of El Salvador, on the eastern part of the country. As my colleague Alicia explained, this area is key for drug trafficking, and La Unión is, in fact, an important entry point for cocaine arriving by maritime shipments. This department was the territory of Los Perrones, which was a transport group, which, as well as the Texas cartel, transported cocaine through El Salvador. But today, it's no longer a territory of Los Perrones. They no longer control this area. But now the gangs, specifically MS-13, are the most important criminal actors. Local authorities, in fact, told us when we went to La Unión, when we were doing our field research, they confirmed that there are some 12 cliques of the MS-13, cliques of the different cells of the gang. So it is precisely this change of power from Los Perrones to the gangs that our investigation focuses on. Our main characters are two cousins who have a very tumultuous relationship. One is Juan Pablo Salamanca and the other is Sergio Umaña Salamanca. The first, Juan Pablo, was an heir of Los Perrones in La Unión, and he had had control over the entire drug trafficking route from Nicaragua. If we think of La Unión, it's on the Gulf of Fonseca, which joins Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. So Juan Pablo Salamanca controlled this entire route of cocaine coming from Nicaragua through the beaches of La Unión towards the north, towards Guatemala, to the United States. And he was a very well-known character in La Unión. He owned a local football team, he owned restaurants, he was a businessman, he had a passion for cockfights, he was a whole character. He was also very violent. He would threaten his football players if they lost. Juan Pablo was murdered in 2015. And investigations by the authorities, it's still unresolved, but the authorities indicate that probably who killed him was his cousin, Sergio. Sergio is also known as Pitbull. That's his alias. Pitbull collaborated with Los Perrones, with his cousin. He helped in the operations part of he helped to introduce the drugs that came from Nicaragua. But he also worked with the MS-13, specifically with a clique called Hempstead Loco Salvatruchos, which started in the United States. For the authorities, it was clear the reason of the motive of the murder. People killed his cousin Juan Pablo in order to take control of this drug trafficking route. In fact, when Juan Pablo is killed in 2015, it takes place in a key period because Los Perrones were already very weakened. The Salvadoran authorities had captured their main leaders, many members. So without Juan Pablo, the presence of Los Perrones in La Unión was greatly reduced. And aside from that, when Pitbull was working with Los Perrones, he had already expanded his networks through Nicaragua, specifically in the department of Chinandega, which was close to the Gulf of Fonseca. It's like the entry point to the interior of Nicaragua. So when his cousin died, Pitbull takes advantage of this takes advantage of the infrastructure, the contacts that his cousin that he had been able to establish, and he seized control of this drug corridor. So the drugs arrived in Nicaragua, where it was stored in security boxes along with cash and weapons. It was transported in speedboats across the Gulf of Fonseca. It would arrive at the beaches of La Unión, where it would enter El Salvador, and it would be transported to Santa Rosa de Lima, which is also in La Unión. But that's as far as Pitbull's activities reached. They didn't go any further. They didn't take over the entire infrastructure of Los Perrones. They just took over this route, Nicaragua, La Unión, the beaches, all the way up to Santa Rosa de Lima, where they would deliver the cocaine to other traffickers who continued moving the contraband. So for the Hempstead Locos, Pitbull was very important for these operations. The speedboats were very important for these operations because it allows them not only to transport drugs, but also to hide themselves in the mangroves in the region, in La Unión. There's a large area of mangroves which are very difficult to penetrate. So it was also good for them to hide from enemies or from authorities. It was an easy way to escape and seek refuge in Honduras or Nicaragua. The authorities, Salvadoran and Nicaraguan, have confirmed that the HLS, the Locos, had a large fleet of speedboats. In fact, sometimes they would force fishermen and other traders to lend their boats for these drug trafficking operations. So the entry point to La Unión was controlled by the gang. They even managed to establish a barrier where they can control the entry point to all the areas along the territory that can transport drugs. So what does this case show us? First of all, it's one of the few cases where a clique of the MS-13 tries to get close to the international drug trafficking. As we've mentioned before, this is not common. In fact, it's a very rudimentary gang. There have been very few examples of figures who try to get involved in the international drug trafficking, and often they fail along the way. In this case, the HLS managed it. So we see an example of sophistication. And La Unión is a touristic area. This clique manages to launder money through restaurants, hotels. In fact, an intelligence source who spoke with us confirmed that a lot of money was being moved in the area, in the area of the beaches, because of the gang laundering activities. So all of these logistics and operations, which are relatively sophisticated and highly assimilated to the Perrones, Pitbull and its clique, the HLS, managed to establish it within just 2 years. But one thing they didn't manage was that they weren't able to move the same large amounts of drugs that the Perrones did. So people tried to change this with an operation in which he planned to move 1/2 ton of cocaine from Nicaragua to El Salvador. This was fundamental for him and for his clique. I invite you to read about the case on our website so that you can find out what happened with this operation. And so you can read the investigation in more detail. But before concluding, I would like to explain why this case is so important. Why was it so interesting for us in our investigation? Well, first of all, because it illustrates the most important points that we've talked about along these webinars. One, that El Salvador continues to be a cocaine transit country. In fact, last weekend, 200 kilos of cocaine were seized in La Unión. I mean, that shows that the route is still active. But point number 2, that the monolithic drug trafficking groups like Los Perrones have splintered. They no longer control entire departments. They no longer control entire areas or even entire routes. Which leads me to point number 3. Smaller organizations, in this case a clique of the gang, have begun to fill power gaps. Not completely, they're not taking over the entire routes, but only certain stages, certain segments. And point number 4 that this case reflects is that different from Honduras and Guatemala, this Salvadorian clique, although it's the exception, it's an example of how the gang has become more sophisticated and is trying to establish transnational operations. In regards to corruption, which is something that we've mentioned quite a bit, in the case of Los Perrones, we knew, because it's very well documented and studied, that the Los Perrones had contacts within the local governments and the security forces on a local and national level. In fact, in La Unión, on the beaches where the drugs would come in, at the police stations, they had contacts that would help them to receive the cocaine shipments and even to guard them. And this area is specifically where today the gang has a presence. We haven't been able to establish how involved they are with political agents. We know they do have some political connections, because obviously that's always important to carry out transnational operations of drug trafficking, but we haven't been able to determine how deeply involved they are. Like I mentioned in the question that Steve asked me a few minutes ago, when we have small groups that are participating in just a part of the drug trafficking chain and that are mixed, it's much more difficult for researchers and for authorities like judges and police to understand how they work. It's no longer such a clear structure as Los Perrones, and it's much more difficult to understand, to grasp the full extent to which they have links with the authorities. And this is a trend that we're seeing in the entire region. So here I'll wrap things up and turn things back over to Steve. Thank you, Victoria. Very interesting. After this investigation, and since you know how the gang operates, or in this case, the Mara Salvatrucha and other areas, why do you think that Hempstead took that leap? What was the key aspect that they had that other cliques didn't have in order to be able to take that jump? I think that in this specific case, it was the link that they already have with Los Perrones. They were working very closely with Pitbull, who worked for Los Perrones and for the gang, and that's not very common for there to be somebody working in both. Generally, the gangs are subcontracted in order to move a shipment, for instance, or they're sold the drugs to redistribute, but they didn't have such close ties as Pitbull did. In fact, before the Los Perrones left the area, before Pitbull killed his cousin, he was already traveling to Nicaragua and working with all these contacts, so that was a big advantage that they had. When Los Perrones left, all this infrastructure and contacts were already left in place, so they were able to come in. But once again, this is very unusual. Yes, it reminds me a bit of the famous Barney case in Sonsonate. We also assumed at the time that it was because he had direct links to a drug trafficking group, and that was what permitted him to get involved in that business, because he had a closer link through a family member rather than the structure that the gang was running. Is there any specific question for Vic? I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about the links between foreign groups. I imagine that in this case, we're talking about foreigners for Salvadorians. Were they able to establish some contacts with Nicaraguans, for instance, in this case? In the case of the HLS, yes, but not beyond that. Los Perrones did have contact with Mexican groups or intermediaries or emissaries, but the gang didn't. The gang has only had contacts in Nicaragua that help them launder money, have access to security deposits, or even brokers that help them to obtain the drugs. But their contacts don't go beyond that. Their contacts are in El Salvador and Nicaragua. You gave a few examples of how they were laundering money. Do you think that these are typical ways that the gangs use? That's one of the questions that we have from the audience. How are they laundering money? Can you remind us the different ways that they're laundering money? And if you think that that's typical of the gang? Yes, what we've seen, and also Alicia could complement this if I miss something, is that they buy properties and businesses. So they buy hotels, they buy restaurants, car washes, these types of businesses. They're not so flashy, but they're important in certain regions. So that's what we've been seeing with the purchase of these types of properties. Ángela, I'd like to go back to the national level and ask you a question, a rather complicated question. And that is, how do you evaluate the President Nayib Bukele? If you had to give him a grade, what would it be and why? Oh, yes, definitely. That's not an easy answer. I would place him at, in terms of what we identified in territory, in drug trafficking, for instance. What we've been able to see of President Bukele is that, for instance, he proposed to militarize the border with Honduras and Chalatenango, but if we were able to show right now on screen the interactive map regarding drug trafficking in El Salvador and its neighbors, what we see is that Chalatenango is not the most important entry point for drugs. On the contrary, like Victoria and Alicia were saying, it's the east of the country is the most strategic entry point for drugs. La Unión is the place where we have the highest relevance for cocaine trafficking, or even the departments that are on the borders with Guatemala. So I think that in terms of evaluation, I don't think it's the best place to send military personnel to fight the war on drugs. I think that's my number one reference point. Here on screen, we can see the border departments that this investigation covered. If we click on criminal economies on drug trafficking, and we type in not just El Salvador but also Guatemala and Honduras, we're going to see, if you take a look, what you see in red on the map, that's the Department of La Unión. Whereas Chalatenango, which is the department that they were prioritizing, that's a department that's affected relatively in a low measure compared to what we see in La Unión. So even though it's very difficult to evaluate the president, I would say that he's not prioritizing the right things in his war against drugs. One last question with regards to President Bukele, going back to the bombshell that you left at the beginning, that you dropped at the beginning. How can we measure his relationship to his acting when it comes to homicide? Should we be celebrating that he managed to reduce homicides? Yes, no, why yes, why no? What do you think? Well, indeed, homicides are one indicator of violence, and it's seeing them reduced in El Salvador. It's excellent to reduce homicides, always. But the problematic thing in this context of homicide reduction is that, well, the explanation of why these homicides are reducing is not so clear. And in that sense, this generates mistrust of the government and weakness. Because what we're doing is that we're letting these groups position themselves. We're giving them social and political capital, even economic capital, versus something that might not be sustainable in the long term. As we saw in moments previous to El Salvador, where we saw a truce that was more explicit, here it looks like there was some sort of informal pact. So, and this is something that never lasts over time, but instead generates very negative consequences for the institutions. All right, thank you very much, Angelita. Alicia, I have a question for you. It's also a rather difficult question. And just to give a bit of context, of course, in the region, the other countries, the neighboring countries, Honduras and Guatemala specifically, have had judicial institutions that are backed by, that have multilateral backing. In the case of Honduras, it's La Maxi, and Guatemala, it's the famous CICIC. How do you see that possibility of having something like the CICIC, which supposedly started the process of establishing? What do you think? Do you see that as part of a solution for El Salvador to create a CCS? Well, Steve, that is a difficult question, yes. But I think that there are important values or aspects that CICIC and MAFIS had at the time when it came to the collaboration with the prosecutor's office in each of these countries. I think it would be valid, yes, and it would allow a frontal fight against corruption and impunity. However, I think that right now, when we're talking about the SCCs in El Salvador, a lot of these points weren't clear. How independent would the organization be? What would their relationship be with other institutions? And I think that makes it difficult to say that it would be the adequate solution right now. But there are some very important aspects, and also the backing of a multilateral organization in the country would be very valuable, and would allow them to fight the levels of corruption and impunity within the country. However, the effort needs to go even further, and I think we're still a long ways from that. We have one last question here, which crops up in every event, and that is the methodology. Alicia, could you explain a bit the methodology that you used for this investigation? Yes, of course. I'm going to start telling you, saying that we have two types of primary sources for our investigations. The first are human sources, which are interviews with lawyers, with prosecutors, with institutions, with NGOs, with local authorities in the territories, also on a national level, in order to understand these specific panoramas of the countries, and also of the departments and municipalities, etc. And we also have document sources, the case files, the reports, academic papers, open sources that allow us to conduct our investigations. If we want to talk more specifically about methodology of the dashboard and what goes behind it, I think that we can also talk about how we had three important categories, and two have been reflected in our interactive map, which are studying the criminal actors and also the criminal economies in the territories, assign to them certain characteristics that would allow us to compare between countries and between departments. That's what the dashboard is for. And you can see it for yourselves and conduct your own investigations. Excellent overview. Well, I think we're wrapping up the event for today. I'd like to thank, first of all, the audience for joining us, of course. It's been 6 very successful events, and we hope you'll join us for future events. I'd also like to thank our researchers, Victoria, Alicia, and there are many others that weren't in this event but that participated as well. I'm talking about Alexander Papadopoulos, Papadopoulos. I would also like to thank Ángela Olaya. She's been the project coordinator, and a very special thanks for all the years that she's spent with us. She's moving on to new projects and will most likely be very successful as well. Likewise to Hector Silva, who spent many years of his career with us, and he's also moving on to new things. I'd also like to thank everyone who helped produce the website and the interactive map, and this program for you, especially Alexandra Urrea, who is our logistical coordinator, Diana Alvarez, who's the coordinator of everything we have in the office, our editorial team. I'm talking about Gabby Gorder, Juan Diego Posada, Diego Garcia, Maria Luisa Valencia, Parker Asman, and Seth Robbins. Our graphics team, of course, Ana Isabel Rico, Juan José Restrepo, and Elisa Roldan. Our broadcast team, Alejandra Rodriguez, Maria Paola Martinez, and Lara Loaiza. Matt Productions, who helped us to produce all of this, specifically Miguel Torres and Jefferson Henao. Our sponsors at PMI Impact, and of course, our host, Sara Garcia. And she's going to have the last word. Sara? Thank you, Steve. We thank you for joining us with your questions and your active participation today. We invite you to visit our website, where we will publish more information about this event and all the project results. We also invite you to continue to share your comments on social media using the hashtag #BorderCrime.